Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. Last year, I did a whole series about the Goatman's Bridge in Denton County, Texas. It was 9 episodes long, and I could have gone on for longer. There was an immense array of online sources with information about the Goatman, from YouTube comments and Google reviews, of people telling their own stories about the paranormal near the bridge. There were videos of people going to the bridge, which is also known as the Old Alton Bridge, and investigating, including episodes of Ghost Adventures and BuzzFeed Unsolved. There was such a wealth of information about the Goatman, and it was so well known that it's one of those topics that you can just talk about for hours and hours, and I did. In the last episode, I talked about how urban legends grow, particularly in the internet age, and I talked some more about Denton, Texas, which is right near where I grew up. I also talked about how it felt like some of the seeds of the urban legends and ghost stories of Denton, Texas that I talked about last time are just starting to germinate. And as far as I can tell in the past, urban legends were spread via word of mouth, and then were occasionally written down in books of ghost stories and newspaper articles published around Halloween. And then, of course, they were also chronicled in the work of academic folklorists and also through incredible initiatives like the WPA's Folklore Project back in the 1930s. So it's really interesting to me all the different ways that urban legends have spread and have been recorded and have been passed around. And that's very relevant to this episode because today I'm going to be talking about the Pigman of Bonnie Brae Bridge, which is a supposed cryptid or entity or person haunting people in Denton, Texas. But unlike the Goatman, the stories about the Pigman have not spread far and wide, and I kind of want to look at what the story is, what the history behind the story is, and also some theories about why I think that story may not have spread as much, and kind of just, I want to talk some more about urban legends and folklore and how they get preserved. So the first stop on that little tour is the WPA Folklore Project. It's something that I mentioned a second ago, and it's something that I find really interesting for a lot of different reasons. In case you aren't familiar with it, in the 1930s, during the Great Depression here in the United States, there was a New Deal jobs program that paid more than 300 writers from 24 different states to go around and document the folklore of a generation that was dying out. Because in the 1930s, there were still a lot of people around who were alive during the 19th century. A lot of things were changing, and this was just like a good time to chronicle everything. And, there were plenty of unemployed writers to do this work. So if you happen to be reading a book about urban legends in the United States, it's fairly likely that this project will end up being mentioned because it's so groundbreaking. And I could be totally wrong, but I don't know of another major initiative by the government to try to chronicle these things and to put money behind gathering oral history and gathering folklore and that sort of thing. I know not everything about the New Deal was perfect, but there's something to be said for, times like now when the economy was bad. The government was actually trying to help people find work and that sort of thing. So it's a program that kind of fed two birds with one scone, right? It employed some writers, and it also did this really important oral history preservation work and helped, a generation of stories not die out, right? And while I was thinking about this, I did go through some of the folklore books that I own, and the reason why I know about this WPA Folklore Project is because I have books that reference it a lot. So one of those books is Gumbo Yaya, Folk Tales of Louisiana by Lyle Saxon, Edward Dreyer, and Robert Tallant. And the book literally has a page where it explicitly says that it's made up of, quote, material gathered by workers of the Works Progress Administration, Louisiana Writers Project, and sponsored by the Louisiana State Library Commission. There are a ton of books out there that were written as part of the WPA Writers Project. So, if you live in the United States and you're interested in folklore, it's worth seeing whether your state has a write-up of all those pieces of folklore. And, you know, as I'm saying that, I realize I have no idea if Texas has one or New York. I've definitely seen for New York, there's a WPA writer's like travel guide, but I don't think I've seen a folklore one. Anyway, that's always a good place to look if you're trying to find stories about a state in the United States. I also have a book called "'Pon My Honor Hits the Truth, Tall Tales from the Mountains" by Hubert J. Davis, who also wrote the more famous book, The Silver Bullet and Other American Witch Stories, which also drew from stories collected by the Virginia Writers Project, which is, you know, a WPA program. And I also have The Vanishing Hitchhiker, American Urban Legends and Their Meanings, which I've definitely talked about before on the podcast. That's written by Jan Harold Brunvand, and it includes stories collected by the WPA program in some of the citations. Though that book mostly pulls from other research by other folklorists and students. But all of this to say, there are a ton of amazing sources for folklore, which nowadays, you know, I think we would call urban legends, from prior to the 1930s, because there was this huge project to write down a lot of these stories. And they have been repeated and cited again and again. But lately, I've been really interested in urban legends and folklore that seem to have their roots in the 1950s through the 1970s. There seemed to be this crop of folklore from that part of the mid-20th century. So many UFO, alien, and cryptid sightings seem to have occurred between the 1950s and the 1970s. You know, to just name a few, the Loveland Frogman was first sighted in the 1950s. The Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction happened in 1961. The famous Patterson-Gimlin film, which supposedly caught Bigfoot on video, was filmed in 1967. And again, when I research hauntings, I am finding a lot of them with roots in urban legends told in the 1970s. And in past episodes, I've talked about why I think that might be. For example, you know, I did a whole series about the history and hauntings of Fordham University, and I found no mention of any of Fordham University's hauntings in print prior to the 1970s. But I know that part of The Exorcist was filmed there in the 1970s, the early 70s, 72, I believe, off the top of my head. And The Exorcist was a cultural touchstone that made so many people think about the paranormal and maybe, you know, be afraid of the paranormal. It really made it bubble into the zeitgeist, so I think there's something there. You could probably also argue that the science fiction films of the 1950s and the 1960s may have influenced UFO and cryptid sightings. So for example, a lot of people have pointed out how The Creature from the Black Lagoon came out in 1954, and the first Frogman sighting in Ohio, and in Loveland, Ohio at least, was also in the 1950s. And there was a lot of cultural stuff going on there. And I wonder if there may have been a sort of feedback loop happening with the media. If people are interested in science fiction, fantasy, and horror movies, maybe they're more likely to notice things in the real world that are tied into the media they enjoy. Like maybe they're kind of tuned into that. And they're more likely to think that something is a monster than maybe just like, I don't know, a bobcat or whatever, because they have that on the mind. And I'm not saying that people are imagining things, but you know, it could be an influence. And meanwhile, if newspapers and other outlets are seeing that people are interested in these subjects, because they're watching these movies and talking about them, when they get reports of weird things, maybe they would have been more likely to print those sort of reports, since there's this demonstrated interest. Or who knows, maybe the car culture of the mid-20th century meant that more teenagers had access to cars, which meant that they hung out in the woods more often or out in the country more often and did more things independently further from home in places with less foot traffic and places that weren't accessible via mass transit. So then maybe that increased their likelihood of seeing things or thinking that they see things, because if you're like a teenager hanging out in the woods, it's very easy to scare yourself, but also if there's something in those woods, then suddenly you're hanging out in those woods and you're more likely to encounter that thing. I'm really just spitballing here, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, you know, why do so many of these urban legends and stories come from that chunk of the 20th century? And so many of those stories, because they've continued to circulate, they've solidified even more because now say, paranormal investigation shows go to investigate. And then people see those, and then the story continues to spread. So I want to talk about the Goatman's Bridge a little bit. And I guess this is the point where I should give a little bit of a content note. I'm not really going to be talking about the racial violence involved in the story of the Goatman's Bridge, but this episode does mention a few other things that you may or may not want to hear about. That includes a brief mention of sexual assault, stories about violent attacks that lead to disfigurement, quoted language that suggests that facial disfigurement is tied to someone's moral character, and mentions of the war on drugs and corruption in the US legal system. Alright, I think that covers it. So anyway, the Goatman's Bridge. When I did my series about the Goatman's Bridge in Denton County, Texas, I also researched other stories of goatmen from around the United States, and it seems that many of them also originated in the 1970s. I'm not exactly sure when the legends of the Goatman from the Old Alton Bridge in Denton County started, though I've heard claims of it beginning in the 1950s, and I've definitely seen people online and in comment sections mention hearing the legend in the 1970s and 1980s. But here's the weird thing about the legend of the Denton Goatman. The legend as we know it now seems to be partially made up, and mostly based on a YouTube video made by a student at the University of North Texas in July 2008. The YouTube video gives details that I have never seen in any media prior to that video, setting a specific date, that the victim in the legend was murdered, and giving him a name. Now, I'm not going to get super into this because I talk about it in enormous depth in the series that I did about the Old Alton Bridge, but one of the things that's most interesting to me about it is the fact that there was this story circulating via urban legend type outlets like word of mouth for a very long time. And when I was growing up in Denton County in the 1990s and the early 2000s, I never heard the story of the Goatman's Bridge. I've since asked around about it, and based on something I've heard from like the friend of a friend, it sounds like the story was circulating at different high schools in the county, but not mine. And because of that, and because, the story was really, it sounds like just told probably by teenagers trying to scare each other, because of that, despite growing up very close to the bridge, I had no idea that it had all this folklore and this urban legend attached to it. As far as I can gather, that 2008 YouTube video got traction, and then the story as told in that video began to spread online. It crystallized a certain version of the story, which I believe is partially fictional, despite being based on real events that happened frequently in the area. And as I talk about in the series, I have found posts from a different person online who claims to have done a lot of work to try to spread that version of the legend far and wide on the internet. Then, because there were more and more blog posts and videos about the bridge, suddenly there were places for people to tell their own stories about strange things happening there. Comment sections and that sort of thing. And then 2 popular ghost hunting shows then featured the bridge, completely solidifying it in the imagination of the paranormal community as one of the most haunted places in the United States, or at least in Texas. And I'm not saying that it's not haunted, but it is entirely possible that other places could be just as haunted, but their stories didn't spread the same way. And the fact that I had never heard the story of the bridge, despite having grown up there, tells me that it is possible for a legend to be very well known in certain circles, while someone, say the next town over, might have never heard the legend, even if they just live like 10 minutes away. And the reason why I was dwelling on the WPA Folklore Project earlier is that, absent any kind of large, concerted effort to collect folklore and local urban legends the way that the WPA Folklore Project did, what do we have to record more recent pieces of folklore? Now, I know that there are still folklorists working out there today at universities and that sort of thing, and I don't mean to denigrate any of their work or say that, they're not doing work to preserve history and folklore. And there are also amazing people like Timothy Renner of the podcast Strange Familiars, who do a lot of work to collect personal stories and folklore from people around the world. So I'm not saying that no one is recording strange local stories, but I would argue that for the most part, a lot of our modern folklore these days gets recorded places like Reddit. There used to be online forums and blogs where people would share their stories, But as platforms have been consolidated, there are fewer and fewer places where people share their stories. And that also means that they have to be motivated enough to seek out a platform to share the story, and be comfortable enough on a platform like Reddit, which plenty of people aren't. Like, I, for one, have never posted anything on Reddit ever, because it's kind of an intimidating place and people are mean there. So I'm just a lurker, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So that definitely acts as like kind of a filter or like a barrier to people sharing these stories online. That being said, I'm very curious about the ways in which legends build momentum as people pay attention to them online. You know, the stories that get told can blow up, like the Goatman's Bridge. Because the more people talk about an urban legend, the more people learn about it, and the more it spreads. They almost have the vibe of what someone might call a tulpa or a thought form, which is the idea that you can essentially will an entity into being just by intensely concentrating on it. But in this case, it might have that metaphysical dimension, but it also has this very literal dimension of attracting people to a story and then having that story spread. Like if you're Googling haunted places near me or whatever, you know, near whatever town you live in, you're gonna find the things that people posted on Reddit or other sites with good SEO, you know? And so then those are the stories you're gonna be repeating. And I'm sure that especially goes for people like me who do research mostly just via, you know, online research and reading in books and newspapers, rather than going out and interviewing people. That's not really a thing that I've done in my research. You know, in the example of North Texas, I don't live there anymore, and the people I know from there don't know a lot of these stories. And I think, you know, most people are like me. They're just kind of like curiously Googling and seeing what comes up. Anyway, let's talk about the Pigman of Bonnie Brae Bridge in Denton, Texas. As you may guess from the very long intro that I did, you know, I've been talking for like 20 minutes and haven't really said much about the bridge. There is not a lot of info out there about the Pigman of Bonnie Brae Bridge. Gosh, I struggle to say that sentence. Bonnie Brae Bridge feels like a tongue twister to me. In fact, I don't even know what the Bonnie Brae Bridge is. As far as I can surmise, it seems like there are perhaps multiple bridges on Bonnie Brae Road in West Denton, and perhaps this creature haunts some or all of them. If you know better than me, please tell me. My email is buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. Anyway, I found this story on the blog Denton Haunts, which I will talk about more in a sec. But let's just talk about the legend itself. This urban legend dates back to the 1950s. High school kids would go out into the woods to hook up, and they would come back with stories about a, quote, grunting, rock-throwing, grotesquely deformed pigman. Sorry about some of the language in here. It sucks that every monstrous urban legend and, you know, every movie villain, every James Bond villain, that's an especially egregious franchise. Anyway, it sucks that so many negative stories in our society are about people with some sort of facial disfigurement. That really sucks. But it's definitely like urban legend fodder in this case, right? And if you think about it, there's kind of a lot of urban legends about people who have been injured or have some sort of disability, and then they turn into a monster in stories. So that's something to think about, right, societally. Anyway, apparently there was a newspaper article, which I've not been able to find so far in my newspaper database searches, though I did not search super deep. And in this article, cops cautioned people to stay away from these locations because there had been reports of someone vandalizing parked cars and bothering couples who were parking there. But it sounds like most of the story of the Pigman came from people just talking to each other. And the tale was that there was a, quote, malevolently grotesque pigman that terrified young lovers and unwary travelers who ventured into these rural regions known as Hog Valley. Teenagers reported that they had encountered, quote, a grunting figure who scurried in the shadows of the creek bed and pelted parked cars with stones, and others told of a man-like creature with glowing red eyes who traveled the roadside with an aggressive pack of grunting wild hogs. The blog post suggests that these may have been pranksters, or maybe they were stories that parents told their kids to keep them from hooking up in the woods, both of which seem totally plausible for at least some of the sightings. Though it's also possible that there could be a mix of something real and copycat hoaxes. Also worth noting, if you go to the blog post, which of course is linked in the show notes at buriedSecretsPodcast.com, you'll see that the post is accompanied by a YouTube video that was made by somebody else, not the author of the blog post. The video seems to be of a supposed pigman who was sighted in Tennessee, not Denton. And just based on what the YouTube account is, and based on the comments and the conversation I saw there, I kind of think it's just a creepypasta. Also, to me, the video looks like a bobcat, though also, what do I know? I'm not exactly a nature expert. But if someone showed me that picture, I'd be like, oh cool, you saw a bobcat, not, oh, that seems like a mysterious pigman in the woods, or whatever. So we can just set aside the video, ignore it, it's kind of a red herring. But to get back to the Denton side of things, the story mentions that this happened in Hog Valley, which it seems to be implied is in or near Denton, but I don't actually know where that is. It's possible that there's a place that used to be called Hog Valley, but now is not called that, just because I wasn't seeing a Hog Valley when I was searching it online, searching for one in Denton. And I've encountered that sort of thing here in New York City where I live now. For example, in Woodside, which is a neighborhood in Queens where I used to live, there was a place called Snake Woods and Rattlesnake Spring that's now just apartment buildings, but it used to be a creepy forest. So, there's plenty of precedent for weird haunted spots to turn into, developments. That being said, there is a comment from 2013 on this blog post where someone says, I played around in Hog Valley many late nights in the early 80s and had been scared off plenty of times. Which makes me think that it's a real place that may or may not still exist now, but if it does, it's just not searchable online. The blog post then recounts 2 origin stories for the supposed pigman. So the first one is about a drifter. So a drifter was cutting through a farmer's land when he was attacked by a wild boar, and then somehow those bites caused him to transform into a half-man, half-pig creature, quote, doomed to roam the creek beds of Hog Valley, ravenously searching for easy prey like unsuspecting paramours parking on the rural roads outside of town. If you can't tell from my tone of voice, I think that's a very silly story, because it's like a pig werewolf story. Points for creativity, I guess. The second story is wild, and this is the kind of thing I'm so happy to come across when I dig into urban legends. So this is the story of the Cowboy Mafia. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was apparently a Cowboy Mafia made up of motorcycle gangs who may have guarded, quote, concealed sites of illegal drug activities. It sounds like sources are hazy there, and supposedly the people who have been interviewed about their, the goings-on haven't wanted to give details, which makes sense. There were, a lot of arrests and court cases related to this, which I'll get into later. But the idea is that someone was, to quote from the blog, brutally beaten by a biker gang after having his nose cut off and a Glasgow grin carved into his face, like the Joker. A gangland sign that someone has been nosy and talking or squealing to police. Horribly disfigured and unable to function in polite society, this pigman was forced to roam the rural countryside foraging for food, sometimes raiding hog slop, or taking shelter in barns, sheds, and under bridges in anonymity, except for an occasional frightening encounter. So the idea here was that the pigman was supposed to be a deterrent so no one else would snitch on the Cowboy Mafia, and the blog Denton Haunts mentions that this would have been a reflection of the community's anxiety about having this organized crime outfit in the area. And, like I said, the Cowboy Mafia was a real thing, and I will get into that more later in the episode. But I also think, before I move on, it's worth noting that obviously this urban legend has its roots in a bunch of anxieties that society had. But it's not lost on me that, this story is about someone who has been attacked and denied housing and ostracized from society, and he is then seen as a monster, even though, in theory, he was telling the authorities about this really, really major drug running ring. And I'm just going to set aside the issue of the morality of drugs, etc., etc. But just in general, you'd think that the average person in society would want to sympathize with the person who, in theory, is like doing the right thing. But instead, he's been turned into this monster. And, who knows if this person even existed? I would assume not. It sounds like an urban legend. But, people are imagining that this person existed and that he's the real monster and not like this drug ring run by like a multi-millionaire who was, to be clear, convicted of many crimes and served some time. So I think it's just revealing that the monster in this story isn't, the drug ring run by this incredibly wealthy man and powerful man in the state of Texas, but instead this guy who, in theoretically was trying to do the right thing and then was punished for it and then was ostracized from society for that. And I do think that, like, as a society, we have a pretty strong bias in favor of, like, people who seem credible or, like, rich, wealthy, whatever. They could be doing horrible things, but, maybe get off fairly easy or still get to be somewhat respectable. Whereas, like, the people who are kind of, like, the poorest, the people who are, like, not making an enormous profit on other people's work, they're the people who become monsters and are ostracized, whereas someone could, have done much worse crimes, and if they're rich and they fit into society better, then, they don't become the subject of ghost stories, So that's the general story. Let's talk about the source. All of the information that we have about the supposed creature comes from one blog post. A single blog post from October 2011 published on the blog Denton Haunts. Anything else that mentions the Denton Pigman, as far as I can tell, gets this information directly from this blog post. Normally, a story like this would be something that I might mention on a roundup episode of a bunch of different urban legends from an area, rather than its own episode. And originally, I was going to just include this on a more general episode about Denton hauntings. But I found this story really interesting and bizarre, and I find this source probably about as credible as any source of Denton ghost stories could be. I've mentioned this blog plenty of times on my podcast, but Denton Haunts is run by a former professor at the University of North Texas, Dr. Sean Treat. And at least at one point he was doing ghost tours of the area. And, last episode I extensively cited a thesis by a student at the University of North Texas who did a documentary based on Dr. Treat's ghost tours. So to me, I don't think that Treat is making up this story. Normally, if I just saw something on a blog and that was the only place where it appeared, I would be incredibly skeptical. And, to be clear, I don't know him personally. I have never met him. But he is someone who has spoken to a lot of people about ghosts and hauntings in the area. So he is in the position to have been told stories like this. So I think this is an instance of someone having been told a bunch of different versions of the legend verbally and just writing it down. In case you're wondering, there are only 3 comments on the blog post, none of which really elaborate on the legend. I already mentioned one of the comments. Another one of them is somewhat upsetting and describes an alleged SA experience that someone had at a local haunted house that involves someone dressed up as a pig, which to me suggests that perhaps someone was kind of playing on the legend by dressing up that way. But they also just could have randomly chosen a pig mask. Who knows? But, that's a unfortunate story. And speaking of unfortunate things, let's loop back to the Cowboy Mafia. So one thing that I love about urban legends is that as you dig into them, you learn a lot about weird bits of history that you never would have come across otherwise. And despite being from the area, I had never heard of the Cowboy Mafia. However, they were well known enough to have their own Wikipedia page. So that's going to be where most of this next bit comes from, source-wise. But you can also find plenty of articles about them. This stuff seems to have been breathlessly reported in the press. So in the 1970s, there was a group of cannabis smugglers who Dallas newspapers dubbed the Cowboy Mafia. They were said to be the most prolific drug smuggling ring in all of Texas. Between 1977 and 1978, they imported more than 106 tons of cannabis over the course of 3 trips from Colombia to Texas. These trips were undertaken on shrimp boats called the Agnes Pauline, Monkey, Jubilee, and Bayou Blues. Each boat carried between 35,000 and 40,000 pounds of cannabis, which was then brought to ranches owned by a man named Rex Cobble, which is a Texas name if I've ever heard one. In 1978, the crew of the Agnes Pauline was unloading their cargo in Port Arthur, Texas, when the federal government came and seized the boat. This led to a high-profile arrest and court case. 26 members of the smuggling ring were convicted in 1979. Rex Cobble, the multimillionaire rancher who is believed to be the mastermind behind all of this, was convicted of many crimes, including smuggling 106 tons of cannabis in 1982. So here's where things get kind of fishy to me. And by fishy, I mean not illegal, just immoral. And indicative of how different people get treated in the criminal justice system in the United States. Cobble was sentenced to 10 concurrent prison terms of 5 years, which, as far as I can tell, just means 5 years, because he was released in 1987. So just to pause here. So it sounds like, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison, but it was arranged in such a way that he only had to serve 5 years. And listen, I believe in prison abolition, etc., etc. But this is an example of a double standard because this was an incredibly rich and powerful man. And around the same time, in the 1980s, a lot of people were being sentenced to very long prison stints for much smaller crimes. If you read the Wikipedia article, it's pretty enraging because, he could have lost up to a third of his fortune of $55 million to $80 million, which comes out to between $173 million and $252 million in 2023 inflation bucks. But the way in which things were structured and actually carried out, it looks as if his family got to keep most, if not all, of his money and investments. And I might not be calling this out if most people's lives weren't destroyed by drug convictions, then and now. But remember that this was happening concurrently with the war on drugs, which everyone knows now was an abject, terrible failure, but which began in the 1970s and which Reagan intensified in 1982. I'm not going to get super into this, but just, the nutshell on the war on drugs is that it was enormously destructive to the United States, resulting in the prison population skyrocketing, which means that families were torn apart and people's lives were ruined, even for extremely minor drug-related convictions. It destroyed whole communities, particularly communities of color, because the way laws were written, they targeted certain people more than others, and it had a terrible effect on this country that is way outside of the scope of this episode, but is significant and still a problem now. So that's kind of like the backdrop for this, and meanwhile, Cobble was convicted of an enormous amount of drug smuggling, 106 tons of cannabis, and you could argue that officials bent over backwards to make sure that he got to keep as much of his money as possible, and that he spent as little time in prison as possible. So, as so often happens on this podcast, to me, the scariest part of the story has nothing to do with the paranormal, and has everything to do with government corruption and how the ultra-wealthy get to live under a different set of laws than everyone else. Anyway, there we have it. I managed to turn a 500-word blog post from 12 years ago into a 4,000-word script for an episode. I was actually going to talk also about Pigman from other places in the United States, but I've kind of run out of time. Just know that there are plenty of Pigman legends from various states. So, much like the Goat Man, the Pigman seems to be a cryptid-type trope that pops up in various places and takes on some of the unique character, history, and anxieties of a specific area. So, do I think there's a Pigman out there in Denton? I don't know. It's awfully hard to prove a negative, and I just don't think we have enough information to make any kind of educated guess. To me, it seems like an urban legend from the 1950s, which may or may not have been based on a real encounter with something paranormal that morphed into a different story based on local news about drug smugglers, and I'm curious what tone the story might take on if it reemerged today. Because, I have no idea if people nowadays, like high schoolers. Like, I have no idea if this is an urban legend that's still being circulated by young people today in the area. And, maybe like the Goatman story, it's just something that I'd never heard. Or maybe this is an urban legend that was a thing back in the day and people still remember it from high school, but like maybe it died out in the 80s or, the 90s, whatever. I don't know. I'm really curious. Like, if it's still a story that's being told by teenagers in the area, what shape does the story have now? How might it be filtered through our anxieties today? Will this be a tale that ends up spreading and proliferating online eventually in a similar way to the Goatman's Bridge legend? Or is this an urban legend that will stay hyperlocal and mostly just spread verbally? I guess by talking about it, I'm doing my part to spread it. But who knows if it's something that, if enough people talked about it, it might catch on or, kind of gain the momentum of something like the Goatman story. But I'm curious, if you live in the Denton area, or, North Texas in general, have you had an experience with a Pigman? Have you heard a different version of this legend? If you live somewhere else, do you have a similar local legend? I would love to know. I find this whole thing fascinating. And it's just such an interesting foil for the Goatman story, since it feels like they could have gone really similar ways, but they seem to have diverged. But anyway, I would love to know any Pigman stories that anyone has. You can email me at buriedcircuitspodcast@gmail.com. Please send your Pigman stories there. And that's what I've got for this time. I'll probably be talking more about Denton next time, because I still have plenty of Denton ghost stories that I wanted to talk about. I didn't originally intend for this to take up a whole episode, but as usual, I got carried away. These things happen. Remember that you can check out the show notes at buriedcircuitspodcast.com if you want to check out any of the sources that I used for this episode, or if you just want to see like a written version of the script that is there. Oh, and by the way, thank you so much to everyone who backed the New Blood Kickstarter. Our campaign has ended. We exceeded our goal. Thank you so much for helping us make 2 cool new paranormal TV series. Whether or not you donated or not, even just spreading the word was a huge help. So thank you so much. If you want more info on the project, remember you can just check out newblood.tv. There's also a Discord server for it that you can join. And it's just, if you go to newblood.tv and scroll down, there's a link to the Discord. So that's like a really cool community if you're like into Discord. I'm terrible with these kinds of things. I lurk on Discords, but I'm not the best at commenting on things and posting. But that exists. And you should check that out if that's your thing. It's a cool place. Let's see, what else do I say in the outro? Oh, if you liked this episode, please tell people about it. Please rate and review wherever you're listening to this. You can follow me on Mastodon at Buried Secrets Podcast at weirdo.network. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. And of course, you can email me at buriedcircuitspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.